Welcome to the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom. Today we're discussing an interesting book that covers American women expatriates who moved to London, England during the late 19th century. The book, which was published in 2006, is titled American Women in Gilded Age London, Expatriates Rediscovered. It was written by Dr. Jane Gabin, who splits her time between New York City and Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Thanks for being with us on the Bookman's Corner.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Lois. Thank you.
And your book, which represents 10 years of research, Jane Gabin pieces together the lives and careers of one group of American women living in London between 1870 and the end of World War I. The group includes socialite Jennie Jerome Churchill, mother of Winston, to novelists Pearl Craigie and Gertrude Atherton, actresses Mary Anderson and Genevieve Ward, and Elizabeth Robbins. As one book reviewer wrote, this is an illuminating study of American women active in politics and the arts who lived and worked in England in times of adventure and trauma. Jane, the American women that you write about in your book were very varied in their motivations and talents, but they had several distinct similar qualities. What were they?
Grit. Grit is the first quality. Each of these women was a very strong individual.
Okay.
First of all, it took courage to move overseas, carve out a new lifestyle, and then to put oneself out there professionally, especially as a woman, in a time when, women were writing, were publishing, but certainly fewer than today. Women journalists were generally relegated to the women's pages or society news. It was very difficult for actresses, British actresses as well, because the majority of people thought that actresses were just a step above women of the street.
Right.
So it was difficult to be taken seriously as a professional woman. All of these women were successful at that.
Well, you think that women had a better chance in London than in, let's say, New York City?
Some of them actually did.
Okay.
The fact that they went to London, for instance, Elizabeth Banks, the journalist, she was working for papers in Baltimore and New York, and she said, I'm going to prove myself, basically. I'm going to go to London, and her editor said, you'll starve there.
Right. I remember reading that.
Right. And she went and made a name for herself.
Yes. We're going to get to her because she is such a dynamic, interesting woman. If you consult the American literary expatriates in Great Britain, the same men's names dominate.
Three men's names.
Henry James, T.S. Eliot, and Ezra Pound. So who are the American women writers that should be included on this list?
Well, when I first started my research, which was a little bit more than 20 years ago, I kept finding these same men's names over and over, and they're creditable authors. But then I thought, well, where are the women?
Yeah.
Now, recently, just before I started my research, Shari Benstock's book, Women of the Left Bank, came out, all about these exciting women who were centered in Paris. And I thought, well, did all the talented women go to Paris and none to London?
Of course not.
So I gave myself 6 months, and this was to show you how long ago it was, without the help of the internet, because the internet had not yet been invented.
Right.
So I thought, within 6 months, can I find the names of a few American authors? And I thought either they all went to Paris, which they didn't, or they published, but all of their writing was just terrible and easily forgotten, or they published, but the word didn't get out.
Sure.
And I found out it was the third thing. So I would start with a clue here and a clue there. I was reading a lot of social history, literary history, and I went from one clue to the next, and at the end of 6 months, I had a huge list.
Okay, and that's your book, right?
Yes.
All this research paid off. Now, you also write about the year that you start this book is like 1874, the year American Jennie Jerome of Brooklyn marries Randolph Churchill and then this goes on to the end of World War I. But why are you focusing on this particular period?
And it's not as though there were no American women in England before then. There were, but individuals. This started a trend. Jennie's marriage to Randolph Churchill started that across the pond marriage market, essentially.
So mothers thought, well, I'll have to send my daughters abroad because maybe they will land a titled
Englishman. And English families also were thinking, well, we need more money to keep the estate going. And there's all this new money because there were the nouveau riche in this great period of post-Civil War. That's our Civil War.
Right. And so the business opportunities have really
absolutely
blossomed, and so there were a lot of wealthy New York families.
There was a lot of prosperity in the States. Now, of course, this created resentment on both sides.
Sure.
It worked for Jennie Jerome up to a certain point. It worked for some others. Downton Abbey is a wonderful fictional example of something that worked.
And but Downton Abbey is after
your
period.
It's a continuation after World War I. Jennie Jerome, though, started this fashion of American women being a force in London, but I didn't want to look at the moneyed marriages. There are several books on that. I wanted to look at women who made professional inroads, and Jennie Jerome is a bit of a crossover because she did both.
Yeah, because she started a magazine,
yes,
which I thought was fascinating.
A literary review.
Now, what do you think about that magazine? How did it do? Was it economically feasible?
Oh, no, it was not at all, which is why it only lasted 2 years. Each volume was very large, and the binding was different for each volume. It was done on heavy paper with embossed leather bookbinding.
Okay.
It was very expensive to produce.
Yeah.
In those days, one volume cost $5, which was
enormous,
an enormous amount of money.
Yes. Well, also in your book, you mentioned that Edith Wharton's last novel, The Buccaneers, written in 1938, relates the adventures of 3 wealthy and beautiful American sisters who seem to be modeled on Jennie Jerome's life, because she did have sisters.
She did have 2 younger sisters,
and they were rejected by fashionable New York, which I found interesting. They didn't get into New York society.
Well, of course not, because the father's source of money was trade. He did not come from old money.
He came from Brooklyn, right?
Well, he moved to Brooklyn, but he was just basically a commoner.
Okay.
Jennie Jerome's mother, Clara,
was very ambitious.
Very ambitious, and when she could not crack that social code in New York, she took the 3 girls and sailed away to Paris.
So she did not go to London at
Not
first.
to London directly. Yeah. She went to Paris, where Americans were a novelty, and very exciting and very well accepted. And of course, the girls could speak French, and they went to French schools. They were teenagers when they went there. They became favorites at court. And then, at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, French people royalty, they had to get out.
Yes, it was dangerous.
It was dangerous. And so they all went to London. And immediately, Jennie became a celebrity in London.
And she was very beautiful.
Absolutely gorgeous.
Yes. And we have a picture in the book of her.
Yes, and she had dark looks, which was considered exotic among the blonde Anglo-Saxons.
Exactly.
And she was extremely bright. And she was conversant in more than one language, and she played the piano.
Yes,
and
very talented.
She was entrancing.
Yes, yes. Well, it seems like with the majority of the women who traveled to Britain between 1870 and 1890, most of them were seeking husbands versus a career, wouldn't you say?
I don't know the exact numbers, but yes, I'm sure there are more who were, and in fact, they were disparaged on both sides of the Atlantic and called the dollar princesses.
Oh, really?
And there was a musical even made about that.
And then, of course, some of these marriages that they made were terrible, right? They were mistreated, really, weren't they? Many of them.
And some of the marriages worked out, and 2 generations later, the family is entirely British.
Yes.
And the Americanism is
gone.
gone.
Yes.
And it's so ironic because this was taking place basically a little bit more than 100 years after our revolution, where we tried to separate ourselves from British royalty, and now
I know
they wanted to get back.
Exactly, and now people are looking at titles, right?
Yes.
They want to marry someone with a title. So that's kind of interesting, the irony of the whole thing. Well, explain how a societal ball in London is critical to the success in making a party in the party scene in London? You have to go to these balls, don't you?
You have to go to balls, but the real coup is if you are invited to be presented at court.
Oh.
And in fact, I found this wonderful illustration in a 19th century magazine, fictional stories, where a young woman is trying on a dress, and she said, "Who ever heard of anyone being introduced at court wearing an American gown?"
Oh.
So you really had to go to Paris to get your gown, and you had to be invited to be presented at court. And my journalist, Elizabeth Banks, did an expose about that as well.
Yes, but she was exposing hypocrisy, wasn't she?
She was very good at that. Now, she herself was a daughter of British immigrants to the United States.
Oh, my goodness.
But she was very American, and she was also working class.
She was born in Kentucky, wasn't she?
She was. She was and raised in the Midwest. Mm-hmm. And when she went to London to be a crusading journalist, and she was very independent, she noticed that in some of the popular newspapers, there were advertisements from some British and some American people saying, "I will introduce you at court," and there was a fee involved.
Sure.
And you needed to be basically, you had to have some money as an American, and then you could find somebody who could sponsor you. Mm-hmm. And Elizabeth posted an ad. She took out a personalized ad in a popular English paper, and people had to reply to a post office box. And she said, "American heiress, new in London, would love to meet people and see the sights. If you can assist me, please respond."
And she got a lot of inquiries.
She did,
yes.
And some of it was on embossed stationery from some of the most well-known homes
in London.
In London and in England. And she wrote about this, and she quoted from the letters. And people said, "Oh, yes, I can introduce you. I can take you. I'll marry you." She didn't expose anyone's name.
Okay.
I give her credit.
Yes.
She was very tactful.
Good.
But she wrote a series, and
it was, I'm sure, well received. I mean,
it got a lot of people angry.
Yeah.
It got the British hypocrites who were going to make money off of these heiresses. It got them upset because she was cutting off their source of income.
That's right.
And she was also making American heiresses who were basically selling themselves look bad.
Yeah, of course. Now, Queen Victoria liked American Fanny Ronalds. And how did she treat her as opposed to others who had had an introduction at court?
Well, Fanny Ronalds actually did meet the Queen, and she was close to the Prince of Wales loved Americans.
Oh.
Fanny Ronalds was in an odd position. She was a married woman. Mm-hmm. So,
why was that odd?
Well, what was odd was she couldn't divorce her husband, even though they hadn't been living together for umpteen years.
I see.
So being married but separated was all right. Actually getting a divorce would make her a persona non grata.
Okay, so divorce was really frowned upon.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And that's one of the things that gave one of the women a very hard time, Pearl Craigie, who got a divorce.
Right. Well, didn't Fanny have a notable British lover, Arthur Sullivan of the Gilbert and Sullivan musical team?
Yes, they were a couple. Mm-hmm. To give you an idea of how much he loved her and esteemed her, he wrote a very popular hymn called The Lost Chord. He didn't write the words. Mm-hmm. The words were by a very popular British poet, Adelaide Proctor, but he wrote the music, and extremely popular. She made the first recording of it on a wax cylinder. When he died, he left in his will the musical manuscript to The Lost Chord. Uh-huh. And when she died, she had it buried with her.
Well, they obviously were very strongly
They
united,
did.
yeah.
They were very strong. But if she had divorced to marry him, she would have been ruined socially. He would have been ruined
Right.
socially and professionally.
Well, let's jump back to Jennie Jerome Churchill.
Yes.
Now, she had, of course, had two sons, Winston and Jack.
Yes.
And but she had a tough first marriage, didn't she, to Randolph because he was ill. What was? Tell our viewers what happened.
Well, they were married for 20 years, and the first few years were very good.
Okay.
She relished being the wife of a politician. She relished being a young mother. She would go out campaigning for Randolph.
And he was in the Parliament, wasn't
yes.
he? Yes.
And
okay.
so things were good until he became ill.
And he had a terrible disease, right?
Yes, he did. And some literary historians say that it was syphilis. Of course, they didn't have the medical knowledge that we have today, but he became irrational and incapacitated, and he died fairly young.
Okay. Now, next didn't her sons then become involved in the Boer War?
Yes.
In Africa, right?
Yes, the Boer War was a very popular cause among the British, and they both were in the armed forces. Jennie wanted to do something because she was patriotic. She wanted to help not just her own sons, but she just wanted to make a contribution. And she led a fundraising campaign to have a ship refitted as a hospital ship.
Oh, good.
And studied nursing. And she was actually called Sister Jennie by the other nurses, and she went with the ship down to South Africa to help the soldiers.
That's very interesting history. Very interesting history. Now, let's talk about Pearl Richards Craigie. You wrote extensively about her, and she was. She grew up in London, although she was an American.
Yes, she was actually born in Boston. Her father, John Richards, was an American who made his fortune in
Tobacco, right?
No, well, later he did tobacco, but it started with quasi-pharmaceutical sales. I say quasi because they weren't really pharmaceuticals. Patent medicines.
Okay.
Carter's Little Liver Pills.
Yes, I've heard of that.
And Bromo Seltzer.
Okay.
And he made a vast fortune, and they had a townhouse in London, and they had a country home as well on the Isle of Wight. And so this townhouse in London was just a few doors down from Jennie Churchill's home.
Now, why do you focus so much on this woman? I mean, why Pearl Craigie? Why do you?
Well, first of all, she did overcome a number of obstacles. The divorce was one.
Okay.
Because that would make it.
But she spent the money to get a proper divorce, right?
Oh yes, she had.
Okay.
And she had a young son, whom she raised. But she lived with her parents. But even though she had money, she said, "I want to write, and I want to make my own living as a writer."
Okay.
And ultimately, she did. And the other thing is, she wasn't known as British or American. I mean, she was known as a very popular writer. There was an interesting article I found in a Christmas issue of a magazine in the 1890s, which listed something like the 50 most influential British women novelists of the day, and there she is listed.
Oh.
And her books were great. I have read many of them, and of course they're all out of print.
Right.
And they should be in print.
Well,
And some of them should be made into movies.
yes. It's an interesting period.
Yeah, but she was a protege of Jennie Churchill. She met Jennie Churchill, and Jennie wanted to help her.
Right. And then they had another friend, Gertrude Atherton, who was also mentioned prominently in this book. Now, what about Gertrude Atherton? Why is she a member? She's an important member of the literary salons.
She
right?
is, although she is a bit separate,
Okay.
because she was an outsider. Okay. Eventually, she became an insider, but not in the same circles necessarily. So she didn't know all of them. She would spend her winters in California, and then she would spend her summers in England. But she became very, very well known in England, and she was covered in British magazines. And she started out, though, as a young woman who knew no one. And in her later autobiography in the 1930s, she would write how she would come to London and she would get invited to various parties and meet authors and celebrities, and she'd go back to her little hotel room and
Write
write down all the names of people she could remember so she could...
Did she send them notes? Did she?
No, but just so she would remember the next time she met them and that
Okay.
sort of thing.
So she was a good networker then.
Very, very good networker.
And so now in chapter 5 of your book, you cover the American women on the British stage.
Yes.
Who were the most famous American actors in London in the late 19th century?
In the late 19th century, it would have to be Mary Anderson.
Okay.
Mary Anderson was...
A force, huh?
She was a force, but she was also a force for purity
Oh.
and goodness. In fact, in my book, there are a number of illustrations, and this illustration is included. Pear's soap. And one of the things about Pear soap, which of course is still sold today, is that it is pure.
Pure.
And so they featured Mary Anderson
Promoting.
this is the soap Mary Anderson uses. It's so pure. And she was really trying to counter this impression of the actress as a kind of demi-monde.
Right.
And so she was very, very popular, I would say, in the 1870s, until her marriage when she retired from the stage. But she came out of retirement to be in a pageant to raise money during World War I. And when people heard, Mary Anderson, they all went to...
So she had a big name.
A number of years
on
ago.
both sides of the Atlantic, I suppose.
Yes, yes. Oh, when she was on a ship preparing to come to star in a play in New York, the headlines in the paper would be, "Our Mary sailing today for New York. Our Mary is halfway home."
When these American women were in London at this time, didn't the suffrage movement begin in London?
Yes.
And now, how did these various women think about this? I mean, Jennie Jerome did not want the vote.
No, she was anti-suffrage.
Which was really surprising to me.
You would think that she would feeling that she herself was a very strong woman,
Yeah,
but no, she was very true. Remember, she's older. So she's maybe a little bit more of a traditionalist.
Old-fashioned, though, right?
A little bit more traditional. Whereas Elizabeth Robbins, another actress, was a tremendous force in the suffrage movement. In fact, she had been writing novels and then turned one of her novels into a very
play.
successful play, Votes for Women. So they split in the way they were dealing with suffrage. Now, Elizabeth Banks, the journalist, she, during the time of the suffrage movement, she was writing for a newspaper called The Referee in London, and it wrote mostly about the arts and sports and some politics, but the editor said, "Now listen, you're not one of those suffragettes, are you? Because you can't write anything about that. You're not a suffragette." And she said, "Absolutely not. I'm not."
Did she have her fingers crossed behind her back?
No. She was a member of an organization, but they were called suffragists.
Oh, I see.
So what she did was she would write a column. What's the latest in New York? The fashion is parties where you would speak in favor of voting rights for women. This is all the rage among people who know in New York.
Right.
So she would simply be reporting.
Yes. And in terms of talking about reporting, you mentioned that Elizabeth Banks became a housemaid and took other kind of crazy jobs to write about the social issues of the day.
Yes.
Can you give us a brief summary of what she did?
Well, her first work, In Cap and Apron, she tells the story of how she got to London after her editor said, "You'll starve there."
Yeah.
So she has a story where she says, "Well, I got to London, I rented an apartment, and then I wrapped up the rest of my money in a handkerchief and walked halfway across this bridge over the Thames and threw it." I don't know if she did or not. It's a good story.
Yes.
She goes to the other side, and she sees an advertisement for a housemaid. So she applies, and she gets the job cleaning house. And at night, she would write about this. So she would write about, and she had a couple of jobs, how servants were treated.
Very poorly, right?
Well, sometimes yes, and sometimes no.
Depended on the family.
Right.
So.
Sometimes the family was horrible. Sometimes the family was benevolent.
Okay.
So she wrote about that, and then now she has all this writing. Where should she have it published? She was a little bit naive. So she decided that the fattest newspaper in London would be the best.
Yeah.
So she went to their office and said, "Here."
Here
They
it is.
published it. So later it came out as a book in Cap and Apron, and she capitalized on the fact of being American. And she said, I'm not taking sides. This whole issue of class here doesn't involve, I'm an American. I'm an outsider. I'm just observing.
Well, it's amazing, her stories. And also, another great thing I read in your book was the fact that, tell our viewers how the Prince of Wales created a tailor-made jacket that was brought to the United States and became our tuxedo.
That's right.
How did that happen?
This involves another couple he got to know, also Americans. Remember, he had this penchant for Americans. And he met a young couple. The wife was an aspiring actress, Cora Brown Potter. Her husband, James Brown Potter, was a New York merchant, very wealthy. They had a townhouse in New York, and they had a country house in the community of Tuxedo, New York.
Oh.
But they met the Prince of Wales in London, and he invited them to come to the country for the weekend. And James Brown Potter said, well, I don't have the right clothing. The Prince of Wales says, go to my tailor. He'll make something for you that he made for me. It's a regular evening coat, but it's cut away, and you'll enjoy wearing it.
Easier to move in.
Easier to move. And so when they got back to the States, he showed it off to his friends in Tuxedo, and they said, that's a great idea. We'll go to our tailors too, and we'll show them what men in the know in Tuxedo are wearing. There you have it.
Oh, well, Jane, your book covers so many interesting facts, and I would like for you to tell us where our viewers can find your book.
On Amazon.
So you can
find some.
And real quickly, what about your next book, your next project?
My next project is fiction, but based on fact, and based on my father's adventures during World War II. He was not, luckily, in combat, otherwise I might not be here sitting talking to you today. But he was stationed in Paris for 2 years. He did not speak about it very much.
So
I found photos after his death. I've reconstructed some events, and now I'm writing a book based on these events.
We hope to have you back for
Thank you. I hope
and
so.
Thank you so much for joining us on the Bookman's Corner.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Please join us again next month for a new edition of the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom.